Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I'm a faculty member at Northwestern University and the director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It is really a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. And today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. Eddy Borges-Rey is an associate professor in residence at Northwestern University in Qatar. Mora Matassi, a doctoral candidate at Northwestern University and coordinator of the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Eddy in just a minute. I am delighted to note that this quarter our series is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Communication Studies, the Department of Radio, Television and Film, and the Program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. But before we go to the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and institutions' history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly a little bit more about how the seminar will unfold. First, Mora will tell us more about Eddy's research and career in just a minute. Then Eddy will present his work. After that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar at the bottom of the screen at any point in time. At the end of Eddy's presentation, we will address them. Mora will moderate. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us. And without further ado, Mora, the screen is all yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Pablo, thank you for having me as moderator for today's edition of the virtual seminar series. It is an absolute honor to introduce our guest speaker for today. Professor Eddy Borges-Rey is an associate professor in residence at Northwestern University in Qatar, and he's a leading expert on digital journalism and emerging media. Professor Borges-Rey obtained his PhD and MA in Media and Communication from the University of Malaga in Spain, and his BA with honors in broadcast journalism from the University of Zulia in Venezuela. Before joining Northwestern University in Qatar, Professor Borges-Rey worked as lecturer for universities such as the University of Stirling in the UK, the University of Malaga in Spain, and the Universities of Carabobo, Arturo Michelena, and Bicentennial University of Aragua in Venezuela. Before pursuing an academic career, he worked as a broadcast journalist and media producer for almost 15 years. Professor Borges-Rey is co-editor of the volume Data Journalism in the Global South, published by Routledge in 2020, as well as co-editor of the forthcoming volume, The Routledge Companion to Journalism in the Global South. His research has been published in venues such as Journalism and Mass Communication Quarterly, Digital Journalism, and Convergence. In today's presentation, Professor Borges-Rey will examine the developments and evolution of data journalism and data civics in Latin America, looking at the particular features that make the region distinct and unique. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Borges-Rey.
Thank you very much, Mora and Pablo, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm super happy and excited to have a conversation with you about my research. If you allow me, I will share very briefly a few slides that I have prepared so that we can start this conversation. Hopefully now you're able to see my presentation.
Perfect.
Yes, thank you very much. So I decided to call my seminar conversation, my presentation for today, Data Citizenship in Latin America. community development, and contestation. And briefly, as an outline to give you a sense and a flavor on what I intend to discuss today, what I will use as a point of departure will be some sort of conceptualization of what data citizenship means, how it has developed in a considerably reduced portion of the world that we nowadays call the global north, for lack of a better term. The ways in which the different mediations and negotiations within data-fied infrastructures take place, to then progress to have a conversation about how these dynamics or the lack of them take place in the global south, and in particular in Latin America. To then adventure myself to have a conversation about how we can conceptualize what happens in Latin America in terms of data citizenship. So I would argue that even though the establishment of data as a concept took place way before this moment, this is, for those of you who don't know, this is the Group of 8 of 2013, where these leaders had a conversation about establishing what it was known as the Open Data Charter. The Open Data Charter was established in 2013 as a means to make sure governments that belong to these groups, to this particular group, were accountable and more transparent in terms of how they handled information within public bodies of these nation states. The idea was that each government will commit to create infrastructure necessary to not only hold and store data about every single decision, council, public body, meeting, session, expenditure of council people, etc., but also to make that available for citizens to scrutinize whenever they want it, okay? And I tend to be quite cynical and sarcastic when I talked about open data, in particular because I was part, during my time in Scotland, I was part of a global initiative where members of civil society join members within the government to try to establish these open data infrastructures in a way that it works well for the citizens. But what struck me as an educator back then, struck me, was the fact that within all the strategies that the government was devising for creating these infrastructures, there was a lack of two very important elements. One was the lack of a sustainable data policy, and secondly, the lack of strategies or initiatives to foster data literacy. So the idea was that they were focusing on granting access and creating the infrastructure for people to access the data, but they were not really training or building capacity within citizenship or citizenry for them to make significant use and gaining insight from this. That's why I call it the illusion of data access. Thus far, and prior to this moment, data had been approached mostly by corporations in industry as a commodity. In fact, Berger and Pushman, in a study in 2014, they did a really interesting analysis, which is a content analysis, a critical discourse analysis of advertisement, public records, third-party organization reports on the ways in which they refer to data. And they mainly came up with the idea that data was approached in two ways. First, it's a force of nature to be controlled, and secondly, as a resource to be harnessed or consumed. So up until then, the idea of data was basically exploitation as a commodity. And remember, this is a time prior to this moment. Sorry, that's not a slide that comes not just now. This is a time prior to us as citizens understanding what data really meant. For us, data was this big abstract that it was something that apparently was an important thing for everyone to know that existed, but the particular mechanics of how data worked were unfamiliar to most of us. Now, when we think about data citizenship, obviously we have to go back to the root of what data or digital citizenship means. And as a means to defining data citizenship and the way in which I approach data citizenship, first we need to really understand data beyond commodity. And it has to do more with data as an infrastructural entity. And as an infrastructural entity, I refer to data as an entity that drives first civic engagement, democratic participation, universal access to many things, education, and other aspects of daily life, but more importantly, as an entity that within the working dynamics of society acts as a mediator in the relationships that we have with each other and with our environment. In that sense, imagine the importance of data in the mediation of those relationships. We now know that as we interact in social media and online platforms, we generate data, and that data then is used by other actors within society to create psychographic profiles of us, to create strategies for targeted advertisement, and all of these kind of things. And now we can make very conscious decisions and assume certain responsibility in terms of how then we share or not share the data with this third party. We can actually make demands to governments and regulators in terms of protecting our personal data and therefore our livelihoods and the ways in which we interact in our identities. But back then, interestingly enough, in looking at this triangle that I'm showing here, data can really grant access to different forms of understanding. From the bottom, from the bottom of this pyramid, you can see that in a very initial state, the more aware you become, you can really understand the ways in which data signifies or corroborates facts, symbols, and other signs. But as we gain more and more understanding of how data operates and the importance of data within the infrastructures of society, we understand relationships, we understand patterns, and ultimately we gain this ultimate wisdom that allows to understand the why of many things. And I will argue that people that reaches these points are especially statisticians, data scientists, computing scientists, or people that are quite fluent in computing coding and computing language, because they are the ones that can really look at let's say a non-structured data set and make sense of the relationships that are taking place within that data set. So this creates an interesting gap. This gap, which has been the main flaw of open data, is that the emphasis has been always in democratizing data access. They tend to believe that by opening data sets and putting more and more data sets online, people will make use of them and magically will make sense of what these data sets tend to suggest. But for those of you who perhaps know that data sets are something far beyond just an Excel table, a table of Excel, that tend to be quite complicated pieces of code, really the data that you can extract, the insight of the intelligence, or the intelligence that you can extract from data, is only available to a few, okay? and those are used at very high levels of society. So it doesn't really matter that this happened. You know, I will argue that it doesn't really matter that we became aware of you know, the kind of things that companies like Cambridge Analytica were actually performing with our personal data, the ways in which they were creating psychographic profiles of each one of us to know what was the element, what kind of information was more impactful and we were more susceptible to, so that they could create targeted advertisement that could really trigger behavioral modification, especially during election periods and especially to change in vote intention. So as we look at that bottom part of the pyramid, you know, the process through which we become more aware of the power dynamics that take place in society, and this is an interesting illustration, since data became or was actually represented in the media or by commentators as a commodity, it was also told that data was the new oil. That was going to be the main driving force of economy. And interestingly enough, in many places after the Cambridge Analytica debacle, you know, the scandal was you know, uncovered and exposed to everyone to see, there was an investigation. A lot of people started to really create a really interesting critical depictions of what really was happening until, you know, unless it is quite uncertain, still there's a high degree of uncertainty about how these companies really operate. And we saw that we started just to put names at things. You know, we started to see data brokers like Facebook, Google, Fitbit, Amazon, a range of companies that were operating in the shadows that we never heard of, and not only we never heard of, but we never knew what they were doing. Like intermediaries like Axiom, Datalogics, or Epsilon, who are they are the intermediaries between users and Amazon. They tend to basically just gather a lot of personal data from us, and they are the ones who create those psychographic profiles. But at the same time, and this happening in the corporate world, we can see that data is also stored in the public domain. You know, national and local government, they hold a good deal of statistics and records and open data. The intelligence agencies and security agencies, they are constantly surveilling, and that generates a good amount of data. Public bodies like, you know, health services, research councils, and environmental agencies. Third sector organizations, believe it or not, they hold quite large data sets that are quite significant in terms of the insight that they can generate. And obviously private companies, retail, network providers, telecommunications, banks, they hold a good deal of data. So by looking at the profile of each one of these actors, you can really deduct that they can hold a really personal data from all the aspects of our life, you know, from the things that we purchase all the way to our medical records, you know, when we get sick, all the way to when we walk on the street and cross the street. You know, we basically just cross the road. All of that has been monitored and is sitting somewhere, and somewhere is not just profiting from it, but at the same time, they are basically actioning these data sets and the insight that they provide to do, you know, really worrying things such as behavioral modification. And just to illustrate this point, a few years ago, I did a research where I tried to create a network of not only relationships, but also to see the ways in which these actors interact with each other, and to try to measure their data power. Okay, so all of the previous actors that you saw in the previous slide, I just put them all together, draw the relationships with each other, and then created an index of data power, which was relying on 10 different variables that deducted which one of them had more or less data power. And you can see that in this network, there are mainly two main domains, two spheres that are kind of close to each other, okay? This one here is what I call some sort of, what we have known as the public sphere. Some sort of more traditional political sphere where you can see many, the media, you can see government agencies, you can see academia, you can see public health services, you can see parliaments and local authorities, and you can see some intermediaries that normally work with the government in terms of, you know, keeping people's credit scores and things such as those that the governments tend to work with more closely. And then this is what I call the new emergent digital sphere, where you can have all these data brokers and their intermediary. The interesting part of this is advertisers previously used to belong to this sphere, more closely to the media, but they have shifted and they have moved all the way closer to Facebook, which corroborates a trend that we know has been happening, is that advertisers are actually just investing more on Facebook. But perhaps something that you have missed is one element that to me is an important aspect for this conversation, which is the citizen. And the citizen is this tiny little node here that connects these two spheres, okay? So you might say, why is it tiny? It's because the size of the node pretty much denotes their data power, okay? So we can see that, you know, brokers like Facebook and Google and Amazon, they are a big node because they hold quite large data power, and similar to advertisers and the intermediaries. For instance, the communications headquarters in the government, or, you know, the surveillance or intelligence agencies also hold a quite large data power. But you can see the local governments, they hold, local authorities, academia, the media, they hold very, very little data power. But the one that holds the least is the citizen. And this responds to a number of things. The first one is that they are quite, they have an issue with data literacy, and they are mostly unaware, and they cannot really action anything related to their data. They actually cannot really protect their data themselves. So this pretty much illustrates the way in which these power dynamics operate. So what you can see is that when we see data as an infrastructure, you know, when we see the network of connections, the ways in which data, you know, is transactional, moves from one node to another, how those relationships are nurtured, how codependent or dependent those relationships are, the amount of power they exert over other nodes, we start understanding that that those mediations really are the ones that are shaping our reality nowadays, and not only shaping our reality, but, you know, conditioning our behavior at large. So the things that define this infrastructural power is that one of the things that I found, and I found really interesting, was that this intricate network of interactions really reinforces technocratic power structures. So we're seeing actually a return, a revival of technocracy, where technical or technical entities or industries or actors have quite significant political power. Okay, and we know that this is happening now. Is become quite evident when they are basically just driving or actioning behavioral change in terms of intention voting, things such as those. But at the same time, the media, you know, what we normally know as the media, is clustering a normative political arena, far detached from that data-critic arena. And this is evident because they are unable to hold to account the same way that they used to do within this normative political arena, those technocratic leaders nowadays. So if they are able to move to the emergent digital arena, they might perhaps be able to hold them to account. And remember, in a very romanticized perspective, we can argue that media is to some extent responsible to holding those powers to account. Interestingly enough, since in spite of efforts to make Facebook and Google accountable by changing their status to publishers instead of conglomerates that are protected by laws of intellectual property and things such as those, this is unlikely to happen. This is unlikely. They're unlikely. The media is unlikely to be able to hold those to account unless a leak happens, which is what we have seen in previous years. So another aspect that is significant here is that civil society is by far the most deprived node in this network, and I tend to agree that this is an issue of data literacy, and they cannot really have any power in keeping protected their personal data. Sorry. So what makes this far more interesting is that, in pretty much the same way as when we were hearing all the time about data and big data and artificial intelligence, and for us, those big abstracts, there were ideas that we couldn't really fully grasp, let alone their impact in our life. So we have seen that mediations from quite a long time have happened human to human through interpersonal communication, and we're starting to see more and more that the way in which we engage in or build relationships with each other are more and more mediated by a machine. But we have examples such as computers that we use, or the mobile phones that we use to engage in conversations or relationships with others. But at the same time, we're starting more and more to engage in conversations with automated entities. Just to give you an example, my kid, who's 10 years old, I have to deactivate Siri on his iPad because he was basically becoming quite closely connected to Siri as a friend. He was asking Siri to tell him jokes, and he said that he really liked more Siri's jokes than the jokes that he was hearing from his friends. So I became worried and I said, okay, let's just stop this just a little bit. The problem will happen is when we are excluded from the conversation, when machine-to-machine interactions are the ones who are going to basically be responsible for our destiny. And we're starting to see some examples of those. Recently, we heard on the news how scientists working for Google were putting into conversation the algorithm that was responsible for Google Translate in order to optimize the ways in which Google Translate worked in translating languages. The algorithm came up with its own language to optimize the way in which translation through, let's say, for the sake of argument, Spanish to English took place. So this language that the algorithm created was completely unknown for those scientists. So that same form of automation nowadays is what is modeled in public deliberation, and that's an issue. That is an issue that that data citizenship has, that we haven't seen in other forms of citizenship thus far, is the mediated machines or automated entities in the ways in which we interact, we deliberate, we make decisions about the future of our country, the future of our local vicinity or such as those. This takes me to Latin America, because obviously we need to look at Latin America for a number of reasons. We need to look at the global south, really, but focusing on one particular region, we're going to start seeing certain problems. And probably you already have guessed what some of those problems are. Now, normally, what counts as data in data-rich environments, okay, places where data is readily available to citizens for public scrutiny, where governments are concerned to create more and more data, where there are policies and educational strategies set in place to foster and to improve data literacy among citizens, etc., etc. We can find data sets in all these places. Statistical releases by national and international bodies, open data portals. For those who have more advanced knowledge on coding, they can build web scrapers and obtain data sets from the internet. They can access third-party data feeds. Some with enough financial resources to acquire these data feeds can gain that insight. There are quite active communities of citizens that are normally crowdsourcing data. There are libraries and trusts. There are people building sensors that generate also environmental data and things such as those. There are a bunch of algorithms. But when we go to Latin America, when we look at the Global South, what we have seen historically is data scarcity, lack of data policies set in place. Many of our governments are not really interested in any form of transparency to which citizens are able to access. There's no policy in relation to data literacy, and data literacy rates are quite considerably low. And most importantly, there's a lack of technological infrastructure, which can really foster these initiatives. But just to give you a few examples that I didn't want to really start a conversation in a pessimistic note. One of the things that my 10 years of research on data journalism taught me was that we tend to overlook the initiatives that are remarkable to take place in our continent. Interestingly enough, just to give you an example, just a year later, after the publication of the iconic data journalism handbook that included a number of chapters from examples from the Global South, but was predominantly covering initiatives that took place in places where data journalism was quite prolific, like the United States or the United Kingdom. Just a year later, it was published, completely open source to a Latin American, or it was a Ibero-American data journalism handbook with examples of data journalism initiatives taking place in Ibero-America. No one knows about this. Only the few people that worked for this, or Latin American data journalists who are quite assertive in finding information. But this is another example. This is the data team of La Nación, Argentina. Okay, this is a quite prolific data journalism team which has won a good deal of international awards. They have been known now by everyone in the scene as one of the top profile data journalism units in the world. And they started quite early in the decade of 2010. Why I bring this example, not just to brag about what we can do in Latin America, there's something really interesting that happened here. By the time this unit was established, Argentina didn't have a robust open data infrastructure. They didn't have the policies to share and to make governments transparent. There was many data sets readily available, and they were really struggling. So as part of the strategy of putting together the team, they hired what they called a data activist. So one of the members of the team is someone who was basically commissioned to instigate and to create an environment which basically pushed for the government to create data policies and to make access to data readily available for citizens. And this was the beginning of what now is a very robust data infrastructure in Argentina. This already tells you something very significant, which is when we look at data citizenship, or for the sake of argument, data journalism in Latin America, we cannot analyze, we cannot understand, we cannot conceptualize, we cannot theorize what happens in our continent through a prism that has been pretty much devised in the global north, okay? And this is, believe it or not, I imagine I'm stating the obvious, but believe it or not, I don't know how many peer review articles I have looked at and I have assessed where the way in which data journalism is analyzed in, let's say, Chile, is being analyzed through theories of the global north, of data journalism in the United States, of data journalism in the United Kingdom. And I myself started this research theorizing data journalism in the United Kingdom because I was living in Scotland by the time. But then when I started to do research on data journalism in China, data journalism in Vietnam, data journalism in Latin America, I started to notice that the way in which data worked in these environments was different. And therefore, I was not only interesting but also necessary to conceptualize these emergent trends and these case studies in a different way, obtaining insight that perhaps could inform future research in the global north. And this has been my main effort lately. Another example is a very, very interesting initiative that took place in a number of countries. It was called Podero Peru, and it was basically a very interesting grassroots crowdsourced initiative through which the portal received thousands and thousands of public documents that were leaked to the portal about civil servants. And they will create this network of power connecting this particular civil servant to companies, other political actors and public figures, just to, this was an interactive tool where you could really click on each one of these actors and see the ways in which they connected. Pretty much like the network that I showed you before. But you could see, for instance, how this person had commissioned the construction of something through this company which was connected to a family member. So it was a phenomenal initiative there was very, very grassroots and crowdsourced. And just to tell you something, this was a very successful initiative too, when research has corroborated that in the United States and the United Kingdom, crowdsourcing initiatives within data journalism have failed. And people are not really engaging the same way that people are engaging in Latin America. Okay, and this is something to keep in mind. This is another initiative, not as positive, and this is something that is happening all over the world. This is, I'm sure you're well aware of the Google News initiative. Googles tend to spend a lot of money in funding innovation initiatives in newsrooms all over the world, and they have a particular call for Latin America. Now we know who Google is. We know what do they get out of this. They're actually able to potentially access the data that is produced within these newsrooms. Otherwise, they wouldn't be spending all this amount of money. And similar initiatives have been happening in schools where they give kids free tablets for them to use in education activities, which are also a way to expand the market share and access personal data of kids in our region. And finally, this is a really interesting initiative in Uruguay. One idea, one initiative that has become very well, it's been celebrated all around the world, is the idea of the data champions. You know, people that within local communities, members of community, members of the civil society, who understand data better than, you know, the regular granny or grandpa living in your neighborhood. Help members of local, you know, places to make sense of data. And you would be surprised the ways in which this works. You know, people helping others to make sense of their electricity fees, for instance, the amount of money they pay, which people tend not to understand how it works. This initiative is along those. The government created this healthcare network, and they basically try to help citizens to understand their medical data and to make decisions about their health, looking at the data that health services and the government hold all those citizens. So this is a very interesting initiative that is aimed at creating better informed citizens, and use data through a portal to make you aware of things that to gaining insight on your own health decisions. So being aware of the time, because I would like to have some time for questions and answers. Well, this is another phenomenal initiative. If you haven't heard of this, this is Post Data Club, which is data journalism venture that is based, believe it or not, in Cuba. So when I heard of them, I was completely skeptic. I was first mind blown because, well, I imagine, you know, probably Cuba is not one of the best places for data transparency. But the way in which they approached this was differently. They found very creative ways of creating themselves their data sets. They didn't rely on public records. They didn't rely on, they crowdsource a lot of data. They look for different ways and algorithms to create data sets that talk about issues of gender disparity, that talks about the ways in which the government behaves, you know, the decisions that are made in government. Really high caliber data journalism that also has won international awards, but also that is quite feisty. You know, it's really, really bold, considering that they are established in Cuba, which is an effort that really exemplifies the power that data citizenship has for citizens to really take control of their lives and to really put into questions the some sort of representations that you know, the ideas and the decisions that not only governments make, but also, you know, third-party actors and corporations and industries. So just to summarize, what I believe is a pathway towards data citizenship in Latin America, we can see that depending on the country, and this is obviously, I don't want to be ethnocentric and to measure everyone with the same stick, but you know, depending on the country, we'll have a more data rich or a more data poor environment. This creates a quite heavily fractured data infrastructure, okay? So we cannot really say that we have a healthy data infrastructure in Latin America because, you know, certain countries are more protective of their data. Some others are actually just flagging open access to data as a way to enhance their reputation. But more interestingly, what we experience in the local and in the global south is something that other countries in the global north don't experience, is this constant data mediation between local and global. We are, as you have seen with the Google initiatives, we are in a constant mediation, you know, we're in a constant balance, you know, scale between actors at global scale trying to exert some form of data power in us, in Latin America, but at the same time, the local governments doing the same. And in between is just us with little power to action, real data citizenship, to have any impact or influence in decision making at any level. Nevertheless, there are really interesting grassroots initiatives that are not only building data sets, but also data literacy and contestation, which you can see in different examples that I showed today. And this is something that we don't see much happening. I've seen initiatives through which people actively within the community provide some sort of scrutiny and actor within a specific data dynamic, someone responsible for holding someone to account. They provide them with enough data for them to be armed in that discussion. But as we always have seen in our continent, necessity, scarcity, the crudity of our life also foster creative ways of overcoming these obstacles. So we have seen very, very interesting initiatives that are very creative in sourcing, verifying, and also finding tools to analyze and sort data, which, in turn creates interesting dynamics in which we become experts in areas that now are starting to have a real impact in the global north, like populism, for instance. So with this, I would like just to conclude my conversation. I would like just to welcome any question, and thank you very much for staying with me here, and I hope the conversation was of interest.
Thank you so much, Professor Borges-Rey, for this very interesting and important presentation. I do have a series of questions, but first I want to remind the audience that there's a Q&A box in the bottom of the Zoom webinar, so you can leave your questions there. I'm gonna start with my first question. And it's maybe out of nowhere, but you talk about the data infrastructure of new media, and I'm thinking about the data infrastructures of traditional media. Maybe this is a kind of a comparative question, but I wonder whether traditional media, I'm thinking television, newspapers, radio even, do they produce data? And are these data important for society in all the ways that you have been describing for citizen journalism, etc.? Is it possible that traditional media have already started historically with the creation of data? For instance, I'm thinking about how television viewers are usually counted with a device. I don't remember the name right now, but a device that they put into people's homes and they observe whether they are watching TV or not. So I wonder whether traditional media can also be considered data producers, whether, if that's the case, data producing by traditional media is prior to new media producing data, etc. Then I have many other questions, but I wanted to start with that one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mora. Well, if we go back to the model of communication in the 1950s, Wilbur and Scrum, the idea of the media as creating this loop, this feedback circle. Okay, it was. I remember when I studied that at university as a student, and I remember, to me, that was the only way in which the media can really hear or can really know about whether people were watching or enjoying, or advertisement was another measurement they had. But these some form of data, if we call it data, and to some extent it is data, was predominantly used as a means to knowing whether a program was going to be successful or not, the impact, the rating, at what time people tended to consume more what kind of content, comedy. Those were the parameters that were used, and those quants were very, very important for decisions at executive level in organizations. But for a long time, the media was not really interested in hearing what we had to say. And you have that as a clear example in the news industry, where a few letters of the editor will make it to the newspaper regularly. So what we see now is a kind of data that is is being used to exert a form of power. You might argue that there's some sort of more traditional one was also exerting some sort of power by making us consume more specific products, by putting in motion economy of the world, but and also to some extent influencing public behavior in terms of vote and all these kind of things. But the way in which these data infrastructure dynamics work now is that they are heavily mediated by automated entities that never existed in the past. Well, there were computers working in those things, but these algorithms are actually just getting to know us better than our family members. I think it was Stanford who created an algorithm that, by looking at a number of likes that you clicked on Facebook, will know better your potential choice than any friend. I think with 100 likes, analyzing 100 likes, we know you better than your relatives, and with 100 likes, we'll know you better than your couple, your partner. So the level of complexity and the sophistication of these devices in understanding our choices are beyond precedent. To that extent, those infrastructures are quite robust in understanding the ways in which they can trigger our fears, they can trigger our obsessions, they can trigger, in a very efficient and instantaneous way, they can trigger our anger, and they exploit those very powerful sentiments to instigate behavioral change, which to me is problematic. We haven't seen this, in television and newspapers. This change had to, you have to be really exposed not just to the media, but also to the opinion leaders within your own community. Opinion leaders had a very, very strong influence on your decisions. And interpersonal communication had a lot of, but we've been isolated on social media. We are completely focused on those screens, and there's little interaction with others when it comes to making those sort of decisions.
Thank you so much. I have one more question, and I promise that I will let other people ask. You talked in different moments of your presentation about the importance of data literacy and how it might even emerge in a bottom-up dynamic. I wonder, up to what point do you think that expert knowledge on data science is actually needed in order to do something with the data and to understand it, to truly understand it and to truly use it? I feel like, and this is anecdotal, of course, but I feel like there's so much data, but only not so many people that actually have the intellectual tools to actually do something. I know of the community of people working on data science, but I know that's not like the largest community in the world, right? So I wonder, up to what point are we talking about expert knowledge that's kind of reduced, or is this something that could actually at some point become common knowledge, let's call it?
That's a phenomenal question. A couple of years ago, I was a director of a project which looked at ways of having a conversation with different actors in the particular society where I was living about and around data literacy. How can we foster it? How can we understand it? And how we can actually reach a mutual understanding of the concept. And one of the conversations that we had was, so are we going to now ask everyone to become a statistician, proficient in numeracy? Are we going to ask everyone to become a data scientist? All these policies that have been heavily criticized in education circles about every kid needs to know how to code. Is that really true? And we came up with this analogy, as a means to explaining this to people. We came up with a very simple analogy, the analogy of the car. Okay, as a normal citizen, you're required, if you wish so, you're required to know how to drive the car, how to switch it on and off, how to avoid an accident, and perhaps a little bit of understanding of the mechanics of the car, how to perhaps change a tire, and that's pretty much it. For more advanced issues, you will always resort to a mechanic. You will always take your car to the garage. Pretty much in the same way, we need to bring people to what we call functional data literacy, a form of data literacy that was not instrumental, a form of data literacy that enhanced the critical understanding of data of people. Understanding that there's a thing called data, and this is what it is your interactions have been recorded, and the ways in which there are transactions with other entities are being translated into advertisement, and they are potentially going to trigger particular things that are going to instigate really primal fears or sentiments on you. Making people aware of all these dynamics, so that if they have a very, very real issue, they can resort to a data scientist or someone a little bit more competent, perhaps a data champion within their own community. But certainly, I think we need to up our game in terms of being able to contest, to challenge the ways in which our data have been used. And this is, a very interesting example is the European Union. Now you have an active role in deciding whether someone gain access to your personal data or not. You can reject those cookies. You can say, no, I don't want you to access my data. No, I don't want to track. I don't want you to track my data. And that's, I think, because we have gained a greater understanding of what happens behind the curtains.
Thank you, Eddy. I know that Facundo has a question, so he will activate his camera.
Thank you, Mora, and thank you, Professor Borges-Rey, for this very important presentation. I'm sorry in advance, my connection is a little bit unstable, but I'm really interested in what you mentioned about this idea of data as infrastructure and as also a mediation between society and institutions and the global and the local at the same time. Particularly within the case of data journalism, my question is, you mentioned this idea of the illusion of access, which I think is really important to keep in mind, but there is also some literature, and I think also some of your work on this about the idea of the illusion of engagement as well, not only like access, but also like people really engaging with data, for instance, in the case of data journalism. So my question is, what role do you think that the institutions that leads these initiatives have in shaping, particularly in Latin America, with the history of lack of trust with institutions, and also like the lacking trust in media companies? What role this has in shaping how people perceive data, particularly you mentioned the case of La Nación in Argentina, and also, well, trying to move in beyond the idea of literacy, but also like the idea of like really like people finding this information relevant for their daily life. So that's my question. Thank you.
That's a phenomenal question. And that's one that I struggle with too. I've seen many things during my research. I've seen, for instance, people in the global south heavily engaged in helping news organizations in holding someone accountable. I've seen initiatives, perhaps not in Latin America, but I recorded initiatives in Vietnam, for instance, where a real estate company sold a number of projects to people on Blueprint, and during a number of years, they didn't build anything. They didn't construct a single house. So the people went to the people of that particular city went to the media, and they basically gave them with all the documents that will form the data sets that they will use to force this company to return money to the people because they didn't build a thing. So there was an example of not only crowdsourced data, but also a grassroots initiative, bottom up, which basically got really good results. Now, we have seen also evidence, especially after COVID, especially after the debacle on misinformation erupted in recent years. We have seen how after a decade of a declining media trust, declining trust in the media, we have seen how the media is starting to be trusted again, especially in the global south. Citizens have realized that the only place where they can go for verified information, and just to also mention, people are no longer naive. They know that, information in the news media is heavily politicized and mediated as well. But that's the best thing we have, as we came to realize that democracy is not perfect, but it's the best thing that we have at the moment. Pretty much the same is happening with these institutions. So another aspect that is really important within the global south, and particularly in Latin America, as a journalist, I remember that the journalism that I performed in my home country, Venezuela, was very different to the glamorous journalism that we see in the BBC, for instance, that we see in New York Times. That is a very glamorous. My day-to-day journalism was, and even my wife, who was covering crime as a journalist, it was going to the barrios every weekend to count the people that die in robberies and armed fire, all of that. I used to do a lot of community journalism, and communities tend to behave differently when it comes to the relationship with the media, especially in Latin America. There are parts where indigenous media is the only means for people to gain access in regions and rural and really, in accessible areas and urban centers in Latin America. So, which also leads me to further corroborate the idea that we cannot really assess and try to understand the ways in which mediations or data mediations take place in Latin America with a prism or with an understanding of theorization on that was originated in the global north, because it is not the same. In the same way that I normally tend to say, well, when we talk about the crisis of journalism, that isn't really happening in the same way in the global north, in the global south. It is, for many local news organizations, for many community news organizations, journalism is still pretty much the same. It's not in crisis. It's the main means through which citizens gain access to information and make their decisions every day. So when we tend to frame a crisis in journalism as a global issue, because a few news conglomerates that operate as conglomerates in 3 countries in the world, 5 countries in the world, are going through a crisis because the business model that was the main source of income for them is no longer working that way, we cannot really escalate that to the rest of the world. So we're seeing how not only data mediations, but initiatives that push data forward, data infrastructures and data policies forward, are taking place very successfully in Latin America and in other regions of the global south. And we really need to pay attention to that and take them as examples.
Right. Thank you very much, Eddy, for a great seminar. Thank you, Mora, for great moderation, terrific questions today. And I want to thank also our audience for staying with us through the end. And I invite everybody to join us for the next installment of the virtual seminar series of the Center for Latinx Digital Media with Isabella Wad from the University of Rotterdam. Eddy, once again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure was all ours. Goodbye.